Well, thank you very much, everybody. And it's a real pleasure to be able to be with you and to be able to talk about reopening churches. And I guess it's really encouraging that we're at a point in the kind of unfolding of the coronavirus crisis when we can begin to think about that and hope for the future that the lockdown restrictions will be lifted and we will be able to reopen. But my personal perspective, and this comes partly from my own experience, from talking to lots and lots of pastors, is that coming out of lockdown is in many ways harder than going into lockdown. And I think this is going to be a sort of a process that takes a period of time. And so really what I want to think about with you today is what do we need to be thinking about now as we emerge from lockdown? I'm conscious that many of the things that I say are probably obvious. You've probably thought about them already. I hope there might be some thoughts that would be helpful to you to take away. I want to try to bring some sort of theological perspectives and some practical perspectives for leading local church. I was struck by a report on the radio this morning about the NHS and how the NHS is going to come out of lockdown. And the point was being made that the NHS can't simply bounce back when the coronavirus crisis is over. People were speaking about the need for staff decompression after the stress and exhaustion that they've experienced over this time. And I think that is going to be true in large measure for our churches as well. So I hope this is helpful to you as you perhaps think about coming out of lockdown and what as leaders in particular we need to be doing and need to be thinking about. So I've got 10 things for us to be thinking about, all of which cunningly begin with re, but that's just my nonconformist heritage. So firstly, regathering. Obviously the most important thing for us as we come out of this lockdown is actually regathering the church physically and in person. There's been lots of debate over this lockdown period of what church is, whether online can replace church. Honestly, I haven't heard anybody saying that they prefer online to physical gathering or that online should replace physical gathering. There's a real desire to want to be able to regather as churches, to come together physically. That's what church ultimately is. Churches are, of course, open at the moment, so we're able to gather in some measure in our church buildings, but hedged around with all sorts of limitations in terms of what we can do and social distancing in church. And we're looking forward to when we can actually gather without those limitations and be much more what church is meant to be. That is slowly coming if everything unfolds according to plan. From the 29th of March next week, you'll be able to have 6 people or 2 households meet together outdoors, which will open up lots of opportunities for church members to meet together in a way that they haven't been able to do so. From the 17th of May, it will be 6 people or 2 households meeting indoors and up to 30 people meeting outdoors. And then the hope is from 21st of June, there'll be no sort of restrictions on the numbers of people that can meet together indoors or outdoors. But the reality is it's still going to be a slow process of getting back to normal. So there are no guarantees, or no guarantees have been given yet, that even though the total numbers of people being able to gather to mix and mingle will be removed, that there won't be a requirement of social distancing. That might continue to apply in contexts like churches. There's been no promise that there'll be a removal of, for example, of face coverings in public places. There's been no promises made as yet on congregational singing. Government has made some noises that they're looking at that. There have been some hints they might allow outdoor singing at Easter. I've not heard anything more on that. Obviously, you'll let people know as soon as we do, but there's no guarantee that all of those things are going to be removed on the 21st of June, although there's a hope that they will be. I think the big challenge for us as church leaders is it seems to me that people are only slowly and gradually returning to church and regathering. I think if we think there's going to suddenly be a point at which everybody is turning up with enthusiasm, I'm not sure that's going to be the case. I've been very struck during this third lockdown at the sort of people's greater reluctance to come to in-person services, even when those have been available. We've found that in our own church here in Market Harborough. There have been a number of factors for that, partly people's fear, particularly in January. It's also, I think, because people don't particularly enjoy the church experience when you come together, when you can't mingle, when you can't talk, when you can't sing, when you're wearing face coverings. It's particularly hard for families with children. It feels like you're not enjoying church you're simply having to control the kids in an environment which is very, very difficult for them. And I think people feel the marginal difference between engaging online and church doesn't make it worth going to the in-person services at this point. At home, you can watch the service, you can sing, you can talk with one another. As an experience, it's much closer perhaps to real church than actually going in these very constrained circumstances. So it's been a slower, I think, return to in-person services this time round. And I think we need to understand people's reluctance. We did a survey of our church members, when were you likely to come back? The numbers who were effectively saying only when all the restrictions are removed on gathering, mingling, singing, face coverings would they really want to come back to physical gatherings. As we think about regathering the church, I think for us as leaders, it's really helpful for us to think that the people that we're going to have gathering when people do come will essentially be a different congregation. We're not simply going to pick up where we left off back in last March or even last summer if we were able to have physical services over the summer and autumn period. The reality is it won't be quite the same group of people, and the people who come won't be the same people because of what they've experienced over this time. In particular, there's going to be a high level, or there will have been a high level of relational atrophy within the congregation. I feel that lots of congregation members have kept up their relationships with the main leaders, and they've kept up their relationships perhaps in their small groups, but they haven't necessarily kept up their relationships across the congregation as a whole. And one of the things we're going to have to wrestle with as we begin to regather is that sort of relational atrophy that has affected people's ability to connect with one another. Some people, I think, inevitably, who were part of our congregations won't return at all. They will have perhaps drifted. Church will no longer have the place in their life that it had before. Maybe some have moved to another church. Maybe some have moved location or are thinking of doing that. Many who were perhaps on the fringe of church might have disappeared. And for us here as ministers, it's worth reflecting on Jesus' parable of the lost sheep and the particular responsibility we have to go and seek the lost, which I think we can easily think is primarily about evangelism. But actually in Matthew's gospel in particular is primarily about going and sort of bringing back those who are straying from the flock, those who are believers who are in danger of wandering away. And I think probably quite a lot of our ministry may well be needing to do that as people begin to regather. We won't really know where people are until they start to physically reconnect. You don't really know what level of engagement many people have with online services. So I think regathering people. At the same time, we'll find in our congregations that there are new people who've come, maybe people who started online and now then start coming to physical church for the first time. There are challenges there. They don't know people. Their experience has been an entirely online experience. They don't actually know what church is like in our buildings and how it functions. And we need to just be aware of that. They're not coming back to something that is in their memory. And then there are going to be some new Christians. So lots of churches have seen people who have been converted over this period of time. And again, they may never have been to church as a whole. And I think there's going to be a whole work of discipleship to do with new people who've come to church and also with new Christians who have just started out on the Christian life. So it's both challenges and opportunities. There's going to be a new fringe to connect with in the life of the church. The fringe of people that are being connected with the church may not be the same group as the church was connecting with prior to the lockdown. There's going to be the challenge of rebuilding unity in the church. And that may well be difficult if there have been quite strongly held views about lockdown or what people should have done, if people are judgmental of the attitudes of others or what other people have chosen to do in lockdown, maybe judgmental of those who've not come back more quickly. I think maintaining and rebuilding the unity of the church is going to be a challenge. And I think we need to be realistic, but it seems to me that the probability is that church may not be people's top priority, particularly over the summer period. As we come out of lockdown, many of our committed members have actually stuck with church. They've stuck with online, they've stuck with groups, they've been faithfully committed. What they've not been able to do is take holidays, visit friends, visit family. So I think it's easy for us as leaders to think church will reopen and they'll make that their priority. I think for many of them, they'll think they have continued to make church a priority, and it's all the other areas of life that have been constrained. And I don't think we should be at all surprised if they choose to spend much of their time investing in those other relationships that they haven't been able to keep up, doing those things that they haven't been able to do. So I think as ministers, we need to give people time to readjust to committing to church and just recognise that that isn't a sign of lack of commitment. It's just a reality, given what they've experienced during lockdown. My personal judgment is probably our churches won't really be coming back together in a sort of a full and meaningful sense until actually the early autumn, and that we should probably recognise that late spring, summer will be a period in which a lot of our people will be away a lot of the time. They often are over the summer anyway. So I think realistic expectations of when the body is likely to regather as a whole. So that's regathering the church. Secondly, rejoicing. Rejoicing. It seems to me it's really important that as we do begin to regather and as we come out of lockdown, that we're able to rejoice together in the things that we are now able to do. That in a sense, that's a recognition of how important they are and how much it is that we have missed them over the period of lockdown. God has been good in enabling us to continue, often online, but we want to rejoice and celebrate that we can now return to gathering in a biblical way. I think, therefore, we want to do the things that we haven't been able to do, to rejoice in being able to sing together, to rejoice in being able to celebrate the Lord's Supper together, to make fellowshipping with one another really important. I think times that we're going to have in coffee, before and after services, opportunities for social gathering with one another are going to be hugely important to building the church in this period of time. Many people have continued to have faithful biblical teaching, but it's all those other elements of church life that they've not been able to enjoy. Therefore, I think we need to make sure that those are particularly possible, and that we're rejoicing and celebrating in them. Building and rebuilding the community, hospitality across the church family. I think there may be a place in church life for perhaps some bigger kind of events or services to celebrate being able to get back together, to mark a new start, both looking back perhaps and lamenting and looking back on the losses that we've experienced over this past year and being totally honest about that, but also looking forward with rejoicing to the situation that we're in. Again, my view is that that's probably something that one could do in autumn as a major restart. There might be a place earlier when the restrictions are removed to have a kind of an initial opportunity to really be grateful to gather together again. But maybe something in the autumn that marks a new start, full of rejoicing and thankfulness for who we are and what we're able to do. Might be helpful for church. I think it's really important for kids and youth to be able to invest in really good things they can do to celebrate being able to gather together again. Again, they've missed out on so much, and we want to make it fun and enjoyable for them to be able to gather again with God's people. So I think building in rejoicing is going to be really significant. Thirdly, what I've called retaining. Lockdown has been a period in which we've tried new things. We've been forced to do things that we haven't done before. And we've developed skills and patterns of ministry that we didn't have before. I think one of the challenges for us to think through is, what do we want to retain into our church life that has worked well over this period? Again, it's not simply a case of going back to where we were at the beginning of the lockdown. There may be things that we've learnt that we want to introduce into our church life, and not simply give up when the lockdown fully comes to an end. I think it's helpful for us as leaders, as we reflect on our church experience over this year, to look particularly to what you might call our unexpected successes. What things have we done that have been unexpectedly successful during this lockdown period? We did them because we thought they were a good thing to do, but they've been unexpectedly successful, perhaps in terms of the numbers of people who've committed to them, perhaps in the impact that they've had. Again, common thing that I've heard from quite a number of churches is that online evangelism, the numbers of people who came to online events, or online Christianity Explored courses that it was quite easy for people to participate in and join. Is that something we would want in some measure or other to be able to retain in church life? Although online church is not a replacement for physical gathering, there have been some benefits of online church. I think for many churches that has provided something of a new fringe for church and an ability to connect with people who wouldn't otherwise physically have come into church and have heard the gospel. Many of our church members have found it very easy to invite people to listen in through links on social media. I think lots of stories I've heard of spouses of people who are Christians but aren't Christian spouses choosing to listen in online who wouldn't actually come through the doors of the church. Sometimes it's family members who don't live in the place where the church is, but because it's their family members' church, they're willing to tune in. So an evangelistic range has extended. Those kinds of opportunities that that online has enabled us to have, how do we manage to keep those and keep making the most of those whilst not making that the norm for church life? I do think we need to recognise the barrier that many people feel in coming to church physically. It's a totally strange and alien environment for many of them. Often it doesn't fit with their life patterns. One of the things I've seen again and again during this period is the barrier to people of having to travel somewhere, park, get out, go to something. It extends the amount of time that they need to give to kind of meetings and events. And it just puts people off coming. And we might find ourselves frustrated that people don't do things because of those marginal costs, but they do make a real difference to people. And if we can overcome them, maybe that will enable the reach of our ministries to be able to be extended. It's not just, of course, our main service, it's our small groups. People might have found that attending their growth group, their life group on Zoom has been easier to come to. We've certainly found that with, for example, sort of parents of children for whom otherwise it means one of them coming and after a busy day at work, driving 20 minutes to sort of meet up with others elsewhere. It's much easier to engage in that in a Zoom format. Prayer meetings, similarly, we found the same, that larger numbers of people have gathered to pray when we've prayed online. Are those things we want in some way or another to retain and not lose completely? For many churches, our social media presence, our web presence has become hugely significant. I do think that is the front door, the shop window of the church in the contemporary world, but particularly with a younger group. And what about the kind of skills that people have learned along the way? What skills have we gained that can be deployed to help our ministries? We don't want to just simply lose all of that. So retaining good things that we have learned during this lockdown period. Fourthly, recuperating. It seems to me that, again, in this period, we and many of our people are exhausted and drained. As we come to the end of the lockdown, people simply aren't ready to go at full pelt at this particular point. I think there's a danger that we might think that that's what the church needs to do, but that we will burden our people who are already exhausted and drained with more work that they need to do at a point at which actually they're not really ready for that or able to bear that. I think that there will be, during this period as we come out of lockdown, just many, many more pastoral problems perhaps revealed, things that have been happening under the surface. I know some things will have come to the surface during this period, but there may be many others. People with crises of faith, people with difficulties in relationships, people with difficulties in their parenting, people with illness, people with mental health problems that may very well emerge. For some, there'll be the equivalent of a kind of lockdown PTSD through what they've endured over this last kind of year or so. I think for many, there'll be a repressed grief, perhaps over the loss of loved ones where they've not been able to grieve properly, perhaps over the kind of loss of life, and they've got on with it and they haven't really had a chance to fully reflect on it, but they will do once things begin to return to normal. There may well be the emergence of kind of depression after the event as people, in a sense, get out of the adrenaline rush of keeping going and have opportunity to be able to reflect. So I think for many, it is going to initially be a period of recuperating after the experience of lockdown. And I think it's just worth us remembering, as we care for the sheep, that there will be many wounded and exhausted sheep who are going to need care during this sort of period. Fifthly, re-envisioning. I think as we begin to regather, there is a danger that during this lockdown period, our churches have lost momentum and lost mission. They've been able to keep going as communities of the faithful, being fed week by week, being sustained in their faith. But inevitably, we've not been able to engage in mission in the way that we might have been prior to the lockdown. That raises the question for our churches of what are we for? What is the goal and purpose of the church? And that brings together the body life of the church, the outreach of the church, the evangelism of the church. So I think there may well be a task on the part of leaders to re-envision our churches for the work of the gospel, for the work of discipleship, for what it actually means to be a church. Come across a number of pastors I've spoken to who are preaching at the moment on what church is, because they're beginning to sort of want to do that work of re-envisioning the body as a whole. I think this has particular implications for evangelism over this sort of period as we come out of this time. It seems to me that very often weary and burdened people don't particularly share their faith, at least not naturally. People share their faith out of a joy in the Lord Jesus. And I think we need, as we seek to encourage them in evangelism, to primarily encourage them rather than burden them with sort of guilt. I think for many of our people, that's what they will most need at this particular time. And we won't simply be able to pick up where we left off. I think it's a key role of the kind of leaders of churches to be those who do set the vision and grant people encouragement to pursue the vision. I think there's going to be quite a lot of that needs to happen as we begin to meet once again as churches. Sixthly, restarting. Most of us have been able to maintain services and often some of our small groups, but there are very many of the ministries, the programs and the activities that were part of our church life a year ago that have had to stop. And I think one of the challenges that we have is going to be restarting a whole plethora of ministries in our church life. It's a different question as to whether some of those ministries should restart, and we'll come to that in a moment. But even with the ministries that have stopped, there might be challenges restarting those ministries. Again, the leaders, particularly if they're lay leaders, the team members who have been serving in those ministries have got used to not serving. For some of them, they may be itching to get back to serving. Some of them may feel that they're delighted not to have been able to serve, and they've perhaps been serving in a ministry because they felt there's a need, and this has been their opportunity to lay it down. Some of them may feel that other priorities and their weariness mean that they're not really ready to pick up the burdens of serving that they had before this time of lockdown. So I think restarting our ministries in the life of the church may not be as easy as we might think. And once again here, I think it's a mixture of challenge and opportunity. It's a chance to review what we're doing. It's a chance to review who is doing it. It may well be that in some of our ministries, leaders can step down and others take up the position of leadership. It may well be that there are team members who step down and new team members need to be recruited in. I think behind the scenes, this is the time in leaders which we need to be giving thought to that kind of issue. I was speaking to a pastor from a church a couple of weeks ago who told me that in his church, they've set up a team, himself and a couple of others in the church, and every week they're getting together on Zoom to review one ministry of the church, to review something that they were doing and give thought to should that ministry restart? How should that ministry restart? What would be needed for it to restart? So in a sense, looking at every aspect of church life ahead of when they actually open. I think it's always been a problem within activism, within evangelicalism, that the danger in our churches is that we become over busy, that we add more and more programs, more and more ministries, and the net result is an over-busy church life. This is the opportunity to make sure that that doesn't happen, or at least doesn't happen too quickly. And it may well be that we don't think of starting everything all at once, but just gradually begin to introduce new ministries within the life of the church. It's going to take immense wisdom to know how to do that. It seems to me that it would be wise at this point to only think about restarting ministries if you are confident that you want them to continue for the long term. But actually, if there are ministries that you are thinking perhaps you don't want to continue for the long term, actually, I don't think it's particularly wise to restart them and then have that discussion later down the line. So it may be worth thinking about ministries and whether you want them restarted for the long term and only to invest in those ministries that will serve the church for the long term. Seventhly, connecting with that is reshaping ministries. So there's a question of whether things should be restarted, but also there's a bigger opportunity to be able to reshape ministries and the life of the church. I think the reality is that in many of our churches, as we begin to start getting together again and operating on a more formal footing, there's a sense in which almost every church is to some degree going to be the equivalent of a replant or a revitalization. Again, we won't simply be picking up where we left off. And it's therefore an opportunity to ask the question, what should change from the patterns of our activities, the patterns of our church life, as they were before the lockdown came? Very rarely in life do you get an opportunity, as it were, to start from scratch again. But in very many of our churches, that's what the position that we've been forced into, because we've only been able to maintain, as it were, the basics of church life through this period of time. Again, that might be an opportunity to think about, for example, our services. What's the pattern of our services over the course of a Sunday? How might that change? The pattern of our ministries, the various ministries that we offer as a church, the staffing of the church, the configuration of our small groups and how they operate and how they fit within church life. How we conduct our church meetings. Are they all going to move to be kind of in-person meetings again, or do we enjoy some of the benefits of saved time and travel that comes through meeting on Zoom? In many ways, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to think about the whole structure of our church life and whether or not it needs to be reshaped in order to serve our mission better for the future. It may be that in our church life there have been some hard decisions that we know have been needed to make in church life, but actually we've been putting them off because we find it more difficult to make those hard decisions. Maybe this is a time in which those hard decisions can be made more easily because events have meant that everything has been sort of brought to an end. So grasp those opportunities. Also, as we reshape our ministries, I think it's helpful to think about, in our lockdown period, about the people in our churches who during this period of time has shown unexpected character and gifts and commitment. So situations like lockdown are a trial and a test of people. It may well be that unexpected people have come to the fore in our church life. They've shown a real strength of character. Perhaps they've been able to serve in ways. And we want to be able to use them in the best and most effective way as the church begins to regather. So who has stood out that has surprised you? And what might that mean for how they could be used in the ministries of the church looking forward? So reshaping our ministries. Eighthly, kind of responding to cultural issues. The lockdown has lasted much longer than any of us expected. I think when it was March last year, we were thinking it was going to be a matter of weeks, maybe a month or so. And here we are a year on from the lockdown. And of course, most of our attention has been focused on the lockdown itself. We talked a little bit about all the issues of the relationship with government, the restrictions that they've imposed, the impact that has had on church life. Now, all of that, of course, has been important in occupying our attention. But as we move out of lockdown and into a degree of normality, I rather wonder if that will be relatively quickly forgotten. But there are issues that have emerged in lockdown that have come to prominence, which I think are going to be much more significant in the longer run for churches and for our ministries than the lockdown itself. Issues that the church needs to address and that needs to confront. In a way, they're fairly obvious. I think the issue of race and ethnic diversity and racial discrimination has been raised very much to the fore during this period of time through the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thanks for calling. So
and I think that that will be a continuing issue that churches and our culture have got to wrestle with. The issues of the exposure of sexual harassment and domestic violence, particularly the mistreatment of women in society, has again come to the fore. I think that's bound to have a significant impact on our churches and our ministries. Within the Christian world at the moment, complementarianism is being sort of spoken of as being intrinsically abusive. That will be a kind of, I think, a challenge in many of our church contexts. Some of this has exposed a very significant and growing generational divide within the life of our churches. The attitudes of the older generation and the attitudes of the new sort of Generation Z and sort of the millennials who are above them, it is a very stark difference. And I think as we seek to lead churches that are reaching to all different kinds of communities with people whose sort of thinking is in very different starting places, it's going to be a challenge to how can we bridge those gaps and build a unity in the gospel without falling into either a kind of a reactionary conservatism or a kind of a woke progressivism. And of course, we've spoken of the issues of spiritual abuse and issues of church leadership. That's been exposed both by the kind of events at the Crowded House, by the Jonathan Fletcher a kind of review. That has raised significant questions for the way that we lead churches. It's raised questions for safeguarding. It's raised questions of vulnerable individuals, how we deal with people at a pastoral level in the life of the church. And again, those will be ongoing questions that I think we're going to need to sort of address. The issue of conversion therapy that's on the agenda at the moment, again, I think is going to be sort of very significant in the next few months. The sort of proposals from the government, how do we respond to those? I think it's a real challenge because on the one hand, there are practices that have been adopted by churches historically that I think we would want to say are inappropriate, they're unbiblical, they're not right. People have been harmed and abused by them. But yet the way that campaigners are arguing, they seem to want to almost be prohibiting any just ordinary pastoral care to people who are struggling with issues of same-sex attraction. And so normal pastoral ministry could end up being criminalised if there's not some care in the way that practices are defined. So I think those issues that have been bubbling under the surface all the way through this lockdown period, even when the lockdown is over, they are going to continue to be present, and we're going to continue to have to wrestle with them and address them in our churches. Ninthly, resilience. Resilience as we begin to open sort of up. And what I mean here is I think that it's easy to think that when this lockdown comes to an end, when we're finally back to normality sometime towards the early summer, that's it, and the lockdown will be over, and we can, as it were, revert to a new normality. Now, I would love that that is the case, but I think we, at the very least, in our planning and thinking, need to build in the possibility that might not be the case. That's what I mean by resilience. We've got to be resilient to the fact that this might not be the end of the crisis in the way that we would love. It seems to me that there's no guarantee that that would be the case. The summer is likely to be a period that is much more back to normal. We saw that to some extent last year with the kind of Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and it felt like life was returning to normality. There are always risks that when it comes to the autumn, there might be events, developments that mean that some of that normality can't continue in quite the same way. I think the big risks that people are concerned about in government are the possibility of new variants of the virus emerging and coming to the UK. And in the autumn, you get a higher level of respiratory disease anyway, so it's more likely that there will be more kind of infections. Now, if the vaccination program continues and people are protected and there's less hospitalization and less death, that may well be manageable. But I do think we just need to bear in mind that as we plan for church futures, we need to make sure that we have built in our minds a degree of resilience to a possible resurgence, so that what we put in place, we can move to a different footing if that is sort of needed. It seems to me that it would be unwise to plan simply on the assumption that it will be a straightforward process of return to normality that will then simply continue. In God's mercy, we long that that would be the case. I think as leaders, we need to at least have an awareness that it may not be. Tenthly, refreshment. I realise I've got 11 points, not 10. I can't count. Tenthly, refreshment. And what I want to say here really is I think as leaders, we need to realise that we can't lead from exhaustion. It's not good, and it's not a good place from which to lead from personal exhaustion, whether that be spiritual, mental, or physical exhaustion. I think when we are exhausted, we are likely to make mistakes. When we're exhausted, we find it more difficult to maintain our godly character and to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit, particularly in our relationships with others. When we are exhausted, we are more prone to temptations and to yielding to temptation. And I think the reality is that this has been an exhausting period. It's been exhausting because of the relentless decision-making processes that we've had to live under. I think that process of constantly having to sort of think about what needs to be done, how do we comply with guidance, what does this mean for the church, uncertainty as to where it's going to be, is sapping of our energy and strength. And that is cumulative and often suppressed in its effects. Again, I wouldn't be surprised that once we are out of this immediate period, that begins to come out in our lives in various unexpected sort of ways. We've been running to some extent on adrenaline for a period of time, but you can't do that forever. So I think here, much as I've said that our congregations are exhausted and we need to be careful not to burden them, not to rush too quickly, I think at the same time we need to make sure that we take care of ourselves, that we are refreshed so that we are in a good place to be able to lead the church when it's really needed. So we want to be in a position to be able to lead well at the point at which our leadership is crucial to regathering and re-envisioning the church and taking its ministries forwards. As I've said, I suspect that for many of us is probably the early autumn, is the point at which we can begin to really relaunch things and redevelop things. And I think as we come out of the lockdown over this summer period, it seems to me that it's a priority that we make sure that we ourselves are refreshed. We may not have been able to see family and friends that we might have wished. We may well not have had breaks that we would normally have had. We might be running on empty spiritually. What will refresh you and what will refresh your soul? And I think this period until the autumn, we would be wise to be thinking, how can we make our own refreshment a priority so that we can serve our churches really well when it comes to the autumn? This is probably the moment of opportunity, because once it gets back to autumn and everybody is really gathering back together and everything is beginning to pick up, there won't be the opportunity for it then. We might feel a measure of guilt about, in a sense, prioritizing our personal refreshment in this period of time. But I think if we don't do that, there could be significant consequences in terms of our cumulative exhaustion, right at the very point at which we need to be leading the church. So in a sense, it's an anticipating, avoiding any kind of ministry burnout later in the year. And as we lead our churches, we need individually to move at the pace we can manage, the pace that we can manage as leaders and the pace that our churches can manage. Hopefully those will be in sync with each other, but our churches need leaders who are refreshed and who are able to sustain their ministries. So personal refreshment, I think, is a significant and key thing for us to sort of work to over this summer period. And then finally, and 11thly, and it's not the greatest of title, but I hope you know what I mean by it, I want to say relax. I want to say relax. I think as church leaders, with all the responsibility that we bear, it's easy for us to feel the weight of the world on our shoulders. We feel the weight of responsibility for our church. We feel an immense concern for the people. We feel concerned about the finances of the church. We feel concerned about how our leadership will be perceived. Will people think that we're doing the right thing, that we're serving hard enough? Will we have the answers to all of the challenges that are presented? I think the temptation for us as leaders is to bear that all on ourselves and to fall into thinking that we ultimately are the saviours of the church and the people. I think the message really here is don't try to be. That's not what Jesus calls us to be. We are not the saviour. We are the servants of the saviour. And as we lead our churches through this time, I want to encourage us that we need to relax by what I mean trusting God's sovereignty. God is the one who is in control. He is the one who is immeasurably powerful. He is the one who has all the resources that are necessary to meet the needs of his church. It is his church and he cares for it far more than you or I ever could. There's a danger of taking a burden on ourselves that we can't carry, and that when we try to do it, actually it makes our ministry less effective. That's not at all saying that we shouldn't be caring, diligent servants, but we do that in a way that trusts God rather than that seeks to carry those responsibilities ourselves. So as we seek to lead the church, trusting in his sovereign goodness and purposes, I think this lockdown has taught us that we are not in control. We're not able to determine events. In a sense, we have to trust God. We've not been able to care for people in the way that we might have wanted to. Many of our programs have fallen by the wayside, but yet God has still been at work in people's lives. We need to cast our anxiety on him and trust him to bear it rather than thinking that he casts his anxiety on us. We need to be people of prayer who do bring everything to God and rely on independence on him, and who seek to receive the peace that he offers, the confidence that he is the one who's in control and he is working out his good purposes. He is the one who will build his church. Ultimately, it's his work and it's his glory that he is concerned for. So maybe we need to find ways in which we don't carry that burden. There's a lot that I've spoken about today, and you might be thinking, that sounds like an awful lot to do. My aim is not to burden you with it. I hope it's just prompted you to think about what you ought to be thinking about as you think of the church emerging from lockdown. But all of us, I think, need to relearn our confidence and our trust in God. So much in the Bible, a warning against anxiety and warning against worry. And the antidote to that is confidence in God and relaxing in him. So those are a range of things I think that churches and leaders in particular need to be thinking about in these times as we begin to come out of lockdown.